Good evening, ITS community. Welcome to our first ever webinar. My name is Nicholas Piotrowski. I am the president and academic dean here at Indianapolis Theological Seminary, where our mission is to collaborate with local churches for biblical and theological training unto the glory of God. The way we primarily accomplish that is by offering master's level courses and organizing internships for students who are in pursuit of a graduate certificate in Christian studies, or a Master of Arts degree, or a Master of Divinity degree. Equally though, as occasion arises, about 2 or 3 times a year, we try to come out into the public to discuss some other issues that are of particular interest to the broader Christian public, but may not be touched on in the regular teaching apparatus of the church. So an opportunity for the Indianapolis Christian community to gather together and consider an idea together. Tonight, we are fortunate and we are blessed to have Dr. James K.A. Smith with us. He is the professor of philosophy at Calvin University and also serves as editor-in-chief of Image, a quarterly devoted to art, faith, and mystery. He is the award-winning author of numerous books, including Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, How Not to Be Secular, and then also newly organized a trilogy of sorts, the Cultural Liturgies trilogy that includes Awaiting the Kingdom, Imagining the Kingdom, and Desiring the Kingdom, available wherever the best books are sold. And then equally, a book that is, we'll hear from Dr. Smith in a moment if there's a fair summary, a summary view, kind of a bringing together of all those into one volume, You Are What You Love. And then also his latest book, On the Road with St. Augustine, A Real World Spirituality for Restless Hearts, available last year even. His popular writings have appeared in magazines such as Christianity Today, First Things, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the USA Today. Jamie and his wife, Deanna, have 4 children, and they attend Sherman Street Christian Reformed Church. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, it's great to be with you in this way. Thank you.
Joining us as well on the screen here is Taylor Bradbury. Taylor is a former ITS student and the current director of ministries at New City Church, a PCA church on the east side here in Indianapolis.
Pleasure to be with you guys.
Hello, Taylor. Here's how our evening will progress. I will ask Dr. Smith a series of questions. We'll dialogue over some of his works. And I've pulled some questions off of Slido. Thank you to those of you who have put forward questions already. So we have some of those in queue and ready to go. But do not put any more questions in the Slido. We're not checking that anymore. Rather, if you have questions and you would like to participate in that way in this dialogue, right below is a Q&A box. You can type your questions right into the Q&A box. Equally, you can see other people's questions and you can vote them up. And so the more popular questions will be moved to the top. So if you see a question in there that really resonates with your own, don't write a new one. Vote on somebody else's, and that'll improve its chances of making its way into the dialogue. So we'll hear more. We'll draw from those questions later tonight. Is that right, Taylor? Is that what we're going to do?
Yep, that's what we're going to do. Once you guys begin your official interview, I'll kind of fade to the background. I'll vanish, and I'll just be sifting through those Q&A questions. So fire away, and I'll pick my favorite ones to ask Dr. Smith.
Good. All right. Thanks, Taylor. Well, here's how I'd like to begin. I would like to read what I believe is the thesis of this work here, You Are What You Love. And if I miss the thesis, okay. But at the bottom of page 20 and following, let me just read here. The reminder for us is this: if the heart is like a compass, an erotic homing device, then we need to regularly calibrate our hearts, tuning them to be directed to the Creator, our magnetic north. It is crucial for us to recognize that our ultimate loves, longings, desires, and cravings are learned. And because love is a habit, our hearts are calibrated through imitating exemplars and being immersed in practices that over time index our hearts to a certain end. We learn to love that, not primarily by acquiring information about what we should love, but rather through practices that form the habits of how we love. These sort of practices are pedagogies of desire. Now, because they are learned, not because they are learned like lectures that inform us, but because they are rituals that form and direct our affections. Now, here's the crucial insight for Christian formation and discipleship. Not only is this learning by practice the way our hearts are correctly calibrated, but it is also the way our loves and longings are misdirected and miscalibrated. Not because our intellect has been hijacked by bad ideas, but because our desires have been captivated by rival visions of flourishing. And that happens through practices, not propaganda. Our desires are caught more than they are taught. All kinds of cultural rhythms and routines are, in fact, rituals that function as pedagogies of desire, precisely because they tacitly and covertly train us to love a certain version of the kingdom. They teach us to long for some rendition of the good life. These are not just things we do. They do something to us. This means that spirit-led formation for our lives is a recalibration of the heart, a reorientation of our loves by unlearning all the tacit bearings we've absorbed from other cultural practices. We need to recognize how such rituals can be love-shaping practices that form and deform our desires, and then be intentional about countermeasures. And so therein, that last sentence is where we got the name for tonight's webinar, Love Shaping Liturgy. So in those two paragraphs, you call them pedagogies, but elsewhere you've called them liturgies, not just things we do as a regular habit because we're thinking about them or not, we just engage in them because they're at our fingertips in our cultural moment, but rather they do something to us as well. And so to begin our time, I wonder if you could tell us, give us some clear directions on what are liturgies, what are these pedagogies, how do they do something to us, and perhaps provide us with some helpful examples of things that, you know, in our culture that maybe we haven't seen or noticed as liturgies, and we do them, and we don't know what they might be doing to us.
Yeah. No, you nailed it in terms of identifying the thesis statement, as it were. That's exactly the gist of the project. It's interesting, you know. I would say the real genesis. This was kind of a decade long project for me that started with desiring the kingdom, and the real genesis of the project was in some ways trying to diagnose the assimilation of Christians to the defaults of North American culture. In other words, it just struck me, why is it that we are not a very peculiar people, right? Why is it that so many Christians just sort of default to the majority culture's sensibilities and way of life? Why aren't we more strange? Which is another way of saying, why aren't we more holy, I suppose. And so in trying to diagnose and make sense of that assimilation, it became clear to me that our best thinking hadn't protected us from that. In other words, you had seen, you know, for a generation, there's been so much investment in the articulation of a Christian worldview and sort of a more robust theological kind of articulation of the faith. And yet it struck me that you could kind of have your worldview I's dotted and T's crossed, and yet still be sort of hoodwinked by cultural rhythms that would sort of suck us back into these defaults of cultural deformation. So that's where I started realizing, okay, it's not so much messages that are the issue here. It's not so much ideas or even doctrines necessarily that's at stake here, because we could have our doctrines in order and yet still be sucked into a way of life that was rehearsing a story that was antithetical to the gospel. And so I started to realize we need a different account of what discipleship is. And one way to think about it is we're kind of shifting the center of gravity of discipleship from just focusing on the intellect, just focusing on sort of depositing the right ideas, beliefs, and doctrines into our intellectual receptacles, and starting to realize, oh no, we need to take account of the habits of the heart. Because at the end of the day, our way of life is much more driven by the habits of our loves than the thoughts we have about what's true. And I know that's, and I'm sure this will be part of what we discuss, but, and I know that's not uncontroversial, but I actually think until we appreciate the extent to which human beings created in God's image are sort of moved on the register of their wants and longings and loves, we won't adequately understand what it means for us to be discipled by the Spirit into the kingdom of God. So that's why I introduced this notion of liturgies, as you call it. So let's think of it this way. And I'm just trying to lay out some sort of fundamentals here so that we could have a conversation. Think of it this way. Human beings made in God's image are actually defined by what we love, right? It's exactly why Scripture, I think, so often resorts to the language of the heart to identify that sort of seat and core of the human person. However, our loves are not just decisions that we wake up on a Monday morning and make. Our loves themselves are habits, dispositions that are learned and acquired through the rhythms and rituals and routines that we give ourselves over to, right? So in other words, my loves and longings, which sort of propel a way of life. What am I after? What am I chasing? What do I want? Those loves and longings, they're not just instinctual, they're learned. But the way they are learned is not so much by intellectual input as affective conscription through ritual would be one way of putting it. So liturgy, the reason why I use the word liturgy to describe these kinds of love-shaping, heart-forming practices is because I want people to understand that we're talking about something religious at stake here. Do you know what I mean? Like this is not just about, how you like to step into the batter's box, or it's not just, we're not just talking about trite routines. We're talking about the kinds of routines that actually shape who we are and what defines us. And so to call them liturgies is just a way of saying these are rhythms, rituals, and routines that, as what you read there, is not just something that we do. So they're not just an expression of what we already believe. In fact, they are the kinds of rituals, rhythms, and routines that are doing something to us. And what they're doing to us is shaping these heart habits. So to call them liturgies is to try to get to the fact that this is about faith. This is about something on the stake of religion and ultimacy.
Now, it ups the urgency of it.
Exactly. I want us to appreciate the stakes of this. We're talking about what's fundamental and what's ultimate. And go ahead.
Well, but equally, even you call it religious, this is happening to everybody, right? Whether they mean
that's the thing. So we're calling it. We should say it's like liturgies, but with a small L. And we're stretching and expanding the concept, because once you sort of look at it through this lens and you say, okay, liturgies are these kind of heart-shaping, love-forming rituals, rhythms, or routines that aren't just something we do, they do something to us. Now, all of a sudden, you start to realize there are liturgies everywhere. And these are not constrained by the walls of the sanctuary by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, that, to me, is the game changer of cultural diagnosis, right? Once you put on this kind of liturgical set of glasses and start to look at our cultural immersion, now what you see isn't just false truths or bad ideas. Now, all of a sudden, you start to see what's at stake in all kinds of things we do that we take for granted, that we've never ever thought about before, as having we just thought of them as neutral and benign. But in fact, when you analyze them through this lens, you're like, oh, wait a second, this is trying to transform what I want. So the most sort of banal example that I usually use, and this, I won't spend too much time on this because I know you've invited your participants to already look at some a video, but maybe one way into it, and we could talk about a couple more examples, is I think consumerism is in many ways probably the most universal and one of the most potent counter gospels, false gospels, in the prosperity of a country like the United States, although I think it's a global reality. And so think of the false gospel of consumerism as sort of the lie that stuff will make you happy.
Yeah.
Which is as an idea, as a doctrine, is insane. I mean, like, nobody could actually defend that doctrine.
Right.
And yet, are there consumerists? Absolutely. Oh, look at me. You know, how do I get suckered into being tempted by this gospel, this false gospel that would tell me stuff could make me happy? Well, it's not because somebody changes my mind. It's because the rhythms and rituals and routines of consumerism, the evangelism of marketing, the cathedral of the mall, all of these over time, especially if I go into it blind, if I don't even think about it, I don't even realize that my heart is being apprenticed by a story that is a fundamentally different story about what the human being is made for. So in some ways, I guess the proof is in the pudding in terms of, can we put on this liturgical lens and see the things that we're immersed in every day, and now all of a sudden realize, oh, there's something more at stake here. If we thought about, I've been trying to think of examples that aren't examples that I already talk about in the books or in the videos or something like that. Yeah. Can I try out a couple of examples with you?
Oh, that's exactly what I'm counting on. Put our liturgical lenses on for us.
So, and I guess I want to, if this analysis works, it should make us all uncomfortable. do you know what I mean? So I just want us to I just want to preface that to say, every time I'm doing this analysis, I'm actually trying to analyze my own cultural immersion, right? So these fingers are pointed this way. But like, to give you another example is, you put on the lens and you look at the ritual and pageantry and liturgy of a stadium. So imagine, remember when we used to go to football games a million years ago? Remember when we used to gather in places? So let's put on our liturgical lenses and now look at a football game, NASCAR race, whatever it might be. And all of a sudden, I think when you've got your liturgically tinted lenses on, you start to see, oh, okay, there's quite a pageant that's undertaken every single time this congregation gathers. And it turns out that there's a very defined and effective and powerful ritual that opens it, which is a litany of sort of the national anthem and the color guard and the military. And if you want to see really the most potent version of it, watch the NFL on Thanksgiving Day, in which, still as a society, we have this vague sense that we are supposed to be thankful, but we can't allow ourselves to say we're thankful to God. And so we end up being thankful to the military. Do you know what I mean? And all of this is, and again, I'm not anti-military. I'm not any of those things. All I'm saying is, I want us to put this lens on and realize, here is the rehearsal of a story of a national identity that is now not communicated intellectually. It is communicated viscerally. Mm-hmm. And over time, and every Friday night lights at the high school football game kind of rehearses that story and reinforces it. And all of a sudden, you don't realize that you've drunk up this story about who am I. And the challenge is, when those liturgies become so powerful and so identity shaping that they actually override our Christian identity. That's the concern, of course, right? The other example, and again, I'm just trying to think critically about my own experience and trying to add to the repertoire of what people can read in the books. I will say that I think until we think in this sort of liturgical model, I don't think the North American church will ever adequately grapple with the reality of racism in our culture and in the church.
Oh, cool.
And I think that's because, let me try this out. If you imagine that racism is just a set of beliefs, right? If you're sort of locked into that thinking thingism picture of things, and you imagine that racism is just an ideology,
right,
then what will happen is you can sort of say, well, I don't believe X, I don't believe that ideology. And then we can kind of comfortably, which would be absolutely true, right? Like I'm not disagreeing with somebody when they say, I don't believe the ideology of racism. I don't affirm those propositions. I hear you. I know that's true. The problem is, it's not whether or not I just affirm this intellectual ideology. The question is, have I been immersed in rhythms, rituals, and routines, liturgies that have covertly and subconsciously reinforced a story that says, I, as a white man, actually am the center of the room. Do you know what I mean? Like, actually, really, this is my town. There's, and I want us to just realize that this happens very, very subtly and over time, and we didn't even ask to learn it.
Right.
But there's a sense in which just by my going through the rhythms, rituals, and experiences of the way so many of our institutions are set up, there's a sense in which I have absorbed that story, and I might not even realize how much I comport myself in the world on the basis of that story. So this is why ultimately I think the liturgical analysis is meant to be a mode of sort of self-diagnosis, right? Where we try to ask ourselves, what has shaped me? What has misshaped me? What has formed me? What has deformed me in ways that I didn't even realize? That's well, I'm sure we'll talk about this more. Sorry, I'm rambling way too much, but I would say that's the critical negative aspect of the project, if you will. The constructive positive aspect is to say, this is exactly why intentionality about Christian formation, and in particular, as you know, my passion is the liturgical formation that happens in gathered Christian worship around word and table. To me, this is exactly why we need to be so intentional about Christian liturgy as counter formation to those other deformed liturgies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. That's super helpful. People are already chiming in. They find that interesting. Let me push you on that, or draw you out on that.
Yeah, please.
And help us put our liturgical glasses on. Can you think of, maybe you already have, just one example, one institution, one practice, one cultural norm that we're immersed in that would sort of counterman our otherwise good intellect? I'm not racist, right? But nonetheless shape our hearts in some way. Maybe just one example where we would say, oh, wow, is that really happening?
And do you mean particularly on the race example?
Yeah, specific on the race.
Yeah. So, and again, remember, this is always going to be subtle and covert, and it's not intentional. But I think I was thinking in my own life, as somebody who travels a lot, right? So I spend a lot of time on airplanes and hotels, and it's intriguing to me. Remember, the liturgies of our lives are kind of like the water we swim in, right? And remember, if you're a fish in the water, you're like, what's water, right? You don't even see it. And so you have to kind of try to find this way to step back and look at what you take for granted. And so as I was thinking about how, as somebody who lives in airports and on airplanes and in hotels, it is what am I subtly absorbing by the fact that so many of the people who are being served are white, and so many of the people serving are people of color. Now, there's all kinds of layers of complication about why the world is set up that way, including matters of justice and injustice that should be talked about. But all I'm talking about is what is subtly happening to me when I am so often in environments where the people who have privilege and prestige are white, and the people who are the support staff are people of color. It's just a very, and then all of a sudden when you put that lens on, you see, oh, okay, this is sort of telling a particular story, not because it's voicing it, but just because like we're subtly absorbing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, you're saying just by living your life, you're doing something, and you're in a space where things are happening. You didn't cause those things to happen per se. You didn't say things should be that way, but you're observing, but you're observing things intentionally. Most of us are simply absorbing it tacitly. I mean, that illustration is so helpful for me to think about my own children. If I think I'm self-reflective on what might I be learning in this moment that is shaping my heart, they're not. They're just learning what they see in the heart.
Absolutely. My kids were teenagers when I started thinking about this, and I definitely think that was part of it. I realized, my kids were, went to Christian school all day, went to catechism on Sunday morning, went to church, went to youth group, and I realized the mall is still winning. The mall is still winning. So I think that's right. And I don't even, yes, I'm a philosopher, I get paid to think, but I don't spend all day thinking about this. And so no one is immune. And I think what we need is the gift of one another to help us think critically about our own immersions. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't think in some, that's the grace of my marriage, for example. Deanna's always happy to point out to me, I don't think you realize how much and to what extent you are being co-opted by that liturgy, right? And I really do think that there's a communal dynamic of helping one another discern our own immersion, our own deformation. Now, I should say too, I don't want this to sound like some really sophisticated fundamentalism where the culture is bad and the church is good, right? It's not that at all. In fact, we could talk a lot more about why it's not that. And I'm not even saying that all cultural rhythms and rituals and routines are deformative. I just think pedagogically, we will appreciate the significance and force of those if we start thinking critically about deformative ones.
Yeah, that's rich. That's rich. As I mentioned, there are several questions that the audience wants to ask, but I feel like I got to ask a couple just right.
Great.
If these are so potentially formative for us, and being together, the communal aspect is so important. Let me get right to this question. My follow-up question is going to be, well, what are the positive? What are those liturgies we can do?
Great.
Right? But first, what do you think is lost in our current situation where we actually can't be together? And, with our technology as good as it is, why don't we just keep things like this, or at least make this online church, online school, online community, just, de facto, or at least as good of an option? What do you think is being lost that, of course, we don't know? We just woke up one day and this was our situation.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of layers to this question, right? And I think one of the things that would be lost, relevant to the conversation we're having right here, is precisely if we'd lost the gift of being iron sharpening iron to one another in this dynamic, right? So if maybe after we talk a little bit about what the positive constructive aspects of Christian liturgical formation looks like, then I would also want to talk about why I think material, embodied, communal, physical worship is actually so crucial to this. I mean, maybe we should just say in general, the way liturgies work is still quite tactile and visceral and material in a sense, right? Like sometimes what I say is the way to the heart is through the body. And the reason why cultural liturgies are so formative is because they're not just trying to convince your intellect, they're trying to like grab your senses, right? There's a sort of kinetic aspect to these practices and rhythms and rituals. And so the church needs the same countermeasures. And I think the physicality of our being together is important. One of the things I'll say about our current sort of pandemic situation is one of the things that's intrigued me is the extent to which it has asked of us a new intentionality about how to be Christians, it seems to me. Like I'm genuinely intrigued. I'm in Grand Rapids. Most of you are in Indianapolis, I think. We sort of know the default still of Midwestern culture. And for many of us, there's still a kind of resident default Christian norm. We go to church on Sundays, you know, Awana on Wednesdays, whatever it might be. And it's interesting how getting jarred out of those just like easy habits, those defaults, now all of a sudden, all of us as Christians have had to ask ourselves and say, well, what does God ask of me in my discipleship right now? And what does it look like for my household, my family, for me to be newly intentional about not just how to worship, and that's part of it, but also like how to be a Christian friend, how to be a Christian community together. How are we going to do this? And I don't know. I feel like we're going to come out of this. My hope is I think we're going to come out of this maybe with some new habits of realizing we had to make choices to foster Christian friendship. Things that might have come unthinkingly before require just one more level of intentionality in our part. And I think it would be a great grace if that intentionality became habit going forward.
Let's pray so.
Yes.
Well, tell us then some of the positive formative liturgies. I know you mean when we're gathered, what we typically mean by liturgy, order of service, but you mean more than that too, not least, but also not just Sunday morning.
Yeah, although I am kind of unapologetic that I'm sort of an apologist for gathered Christian worship around word and table is the hub of discipleship. Do you know what I mean? So I guess one of my real burdens is to say there are no Lone Ranger Christians, and it's not a freelance project. And there is a very, very specific reason why God calls us to gather as the people of God. But the reason for our gathering is not informational. And this is I think the turn that some Protestant congregations are leaning into, which is I don't think the church is a lecture hall. I don't think God primarily calls us to gather around word and table for me to be informed. Am I informed? Am I learning? Is there a didactic element to worship? Of course. However, I think most fundamentally, the reason why we are called to gather and worship is so that we can be re-storied, right? For me, Christian worship is really about the communal, tangible, practiced rehearsal of the gospel. Over and over and over again, precisely so that it's sinking into my bones, it's getting under my skin, it's seeping into my heart, and I am becoming gospeled, not just because of the information I learned, but because God's story of reconciling all things to himself in Christ is becoming now my orienting story. And that happens really through the entire arc, the sort of the script of what the people of God do when they gather for worship. I guess one thing I should qualify is that when I use the word worship, I mean more than music. I think a lot of people, the last 30 years, we tend to think there's the worship time at the beginning of church and then the sermon and whatever else.
Fillers.
Oh, no, that's a very, very unhelpful habit we've developed. When I say worship, I mean the whole sort of
Ebb and flow.
yes, script, the rhythm from call to worship to benediction, every single element of Christian worship is a chapter in the story of God's redemption. And to take one example, so I'm Reformed Presbyterian, and whenever we would gather and worship, to take just one example, there would always be, let's call it a chapter, in which we would engage in communal confession of our sin and hear the assurance of God's pardon, absolution. I think that is a very, very powerful counter liturgy to our culture, right? In so many ways. And for me, it's very, very hard to imagine a service of Christian worship that doesn't rehearse that chapter of God's grace and my confession, you know? So there's a sense in which I do think the hub of really, truly formative Christian discipleship is that kind of rich worship experience. Yeah. But it also spirals into spiritual disciplines Monday to Saturday that we observe as well, right? That there are ways that we can be intentional about our formation communally, collectively through the week. We absolutely have to be. And I also think that there are formative disciplines that aren't just, they don't all look churchy necessarily, right? They don't all, you know, in You Are What You Love, for example, I try to talk about why I think a family dinner table is a liturgy. Do you know what I mean? Like a family sitting down and committing themselves to the fellowship of being together around a meal. That might sound like, wow, that's uninteresting. Over a lifetime, it, I think, literally rehearses a story about God's covenant faithfulness. And it creates spaces for formation, reflection, contemplation, love building, that we should just not underestimate. So in some ways, one of the cool things is once you learn how to put on these liturgical lenses, you can also look at things you already do and realize, oh, that's why we do that, right? Like there was an intentionality behind that maybe you can articulate anew. So it's not just about like, what do I have to add to my life? In some ways, you can say, this explains why we do what we do.
Yeah. So my thought on that is you're saying that you mentioned an arc, right? So when we gather on Sunday morning,
yeah,
it's not just that we go from, okay, this is a secular world over here and there's all kinds of anti-gospel material. We gather together and then there's just a straight line of truth for the next hour and a half or whatever, and then bam, back into the world. You're saying there's actually some kind of developmental arc from gathering to benediction, that if you miss one of those points in there, the story becomes a little less coherent, a little less, therefore, a little less formative.
A little less formative, and you miss out on the counter-formative power of some of those elements. So like, for example, I try to make the pitch for contemporary Christians to find wisdom in what I'll just call historic Christian worship. I'm not interested in traditionalism. I'm interested in the tradition's gifts about what a Christian service of worship looks like. And I mean, John Calvin and Martin Luther are included in this, right? And what's interesting is, you know, the reason why a historic service of worship begins with a call to worship, just take one minor thing, is it's precisely a reminder of, first of all, God is the initiator of our worship, right? When worship starts with a call to worship, we are already immediately reminded that God is the primary agent in our worship. He's not the audience sitting back waiting for us to perform. He is the actor who is actually calling us into his life. I think that's a game changer for what you think worship is. I think the default paradigm of a lot of Christian worship today is an expressivist paradigm where we think we're showing up to put on a show for God, and God is this passive recipient. And I think that's a really problematic, but also a missed opportunity for understanding what worship is about. So the call to worship, but you also realize every single time God calls us to worship, it's an echo of Genesis 1-2. This is a recreation project every single time God calls us. And then if you think if it goes through, I mean, in Desiring the Kingdom, I try to walk through every element of a service of Christian worship and show the story that's being rehearsed there. You know, like an offering is an exercise in kingdom economics. It's a glimpse of what economics looks like in a redeemed world, right? So let's not underestimate how much that's a formative experience. But then let's go all the way to the end. The end of worship is not a dismissal. I'm going to get on a little soapbox here because I feel passionate about this. The end of worship is not when the band turns the lights up and says, you're free to go. Do you know? It's like, oh my God. No. The end of worship is the benediction.
Yes.
And that's not so that we can be churchy. It's because the whole point of our being gathered into God's people is so that we can be sent as his image bearers and ambassadors and proclaimers and renewers. So the reason why he calls us to worship and then sends us with a benediction is because every single time we leave worship, we are being commissioned again to be God's image bearers for our neighbors and to the world. And so I think it's really important to keep asking ourselves critically as well, what story is our church's worship rehearsing? And it's a tough question because it's not always rehearsing what you might think. You know, in the same way that I might not love what I think, my congregation might not love what it thinks in the story it performs in Christian worship, right? We can sort of end up, in the name of relevance, we end up sort of wheeling in these cultural liturgies, and that's because we thought they were just these neutral strategies.
Yeah.
But in fact, they're already loaded to prime people to look for happiness in a certain end. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And so to go back to the one example you used before, the confession, I realize there are a lot of other moments between call to worship but the confession, if that's not there, then what are you really articulating? What are you rehearsing about the gospel if that's not there? And the absolution, right?
Exactly. And the practice of being honest about, I mean, to practice confession is also to practice your way into a kind of graced humility, which seems like a really, really important virtue for the people of God. But it would also be terrible and equally a false gospel if you had confession without the good news of God's forgiveness. Do you know what I mean? And in some ways, consumer culture has its own litanies of telling you how bad you are.
Right.
Without promising the freedom of forgiveness, it just sells you a product to try to fix it. And that's a very, very different story. So I feel like if a worship service doesn't have that chapter, to take just one example of confession and assurance of pardon, you both can sort of fall into the cultural liturgy of believing yourselfism. I'm everybody's a good person. But you could also fall into really distorted religious false liturgies of kind of worm theology and consumerist ideas of you're a problem. And it's just shame culture. It just becomes shame culture. And consumerism, ironically, thrives on shame culture in many ways.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's ironic. That's one thing I think people can see. And let me ask you two questions, then we'll bring Taylor in here with questions from the participants. Cool. I want to return to the comment you made about the kind of racism that is being potentially or is being engendered, right, tacitly. Let me take a different example. What about sexuality and gender? I wonder if you see any cultural liturgies, cultural pedagogies that Christians or largely the culture at large are participating in. They're doing something to us that, you know, dare I ask you to be a prophet for a moment, 20 years from now, we'll look back and say, oh man, look at how we were being covertly co-opted to a rival vision of gender and sexuality?
Yeah, I think overall, part of me wants to talk about this question in terms of men and women, but I think we might disagree on these matters, so I'm going to put that off to the side. I think culturally, I think the cultural liturgies of sexuality that are predicated only and simply on autonomy and expression of self-identity are a story that is very hard to avoid, and we have all swallowed much more than we realize.
Basically.
So I would say, to take one example, I mean, I think there are all kinds of young Christians who get married who still have not adequately taken stock of the disordered view of sexuality that they've absorbed, precisely because they still imagine, they've bought the culture story that sex is an experience for self-fulfillment rather than
and self-identity.
Self-expression, self-identity, rather than the consummation of a oneness that God is calling us to, right? And so in that sense, I think the ubiquity of that prioritizing of autonomy and self-expression is, I mean, that the water is high in that story, and I think it'd be disturbing actually to see how many even Christian books on marriage and sex subtly fall into the trap of thinking about sex in that way, you know. Ironically, there are a lot of Christians who are very romantic about sex, and I think that's a reflection of a cultural liturgy they've absorbed, not a biblical understanding of what the covenant of marriage is. Yeah,
it's helpful. Okay, let me ask you another question that I think particularly challenges me, if I may. So I'm the dean of a seminary, and we teach classes, and we assign books and
of
papers,
course,
final exams, and I myself love giving lectures. You can ask my students.
Same here.
They enjoy listening as much as I like delivering them. But so what kind of advice can you give educators? You talk, I think, a fair bit more on the elementary and middle school level in your books, but how about for andragogy, right? For adult education, what are, I mean, you can take this in several directions, either particular techniques or just implications of what it means to educate in a system where we have ideas we want to get across, so that we have premises, arguments, warrant, logic, conclusion, foils.
Absolutely. So, and just to be clear, nothing in my project is meant to undercut the life of the mind. Do you know what I mean? Like I literally have sold my soul to that project. You know, like I'm a philosopher. I teach at Calvin University. We care about the Reformed intellectual project. So what I'm talking about is situating the life of the mind. So not overestimating it, but in many ways, for example, everything we're doing tonight is actually reflection. Everything we're doing tonight is engaging in critical reflection on practice. And so the way I envision it is, ideally, there's this kind of feedback loop where we develop these intellectual virtues and skills and capacities and theological insights. That's precisely what gives us then the resources to think critically on our practice, to renew it and become more intentional about our practice. So that's one way of affirming the significance, importance of it. Now, about theological education itself, I think all it means is that theological education has to be holistic. It's not about doing less than ideas, it's about doing more than ideas, right? And so I think it's about embedding the intellectual endeavor of theological education in a holistic version of pursuing the spiritual disciplines, being immersed in the formative practices of Christian worship. And from what I understand of Indianapolis Theological Seminary, in a way, you guys have a unique opportunity because so many of your students are concurrently already embedded in congregations, in communities and things. And I think the most formative theological education going forward is going to be intentional on both of these fronts, so that it's the whole person. I think a travesty of theological education would be to have somebody who can pass all the exams, but whose heart has still been hoodwinked by rival liturgies. It's just about closing that gap and realizing, maybe last thing I'll say about this, you can't think your way out of liturgical deformation. You can't think your way out. So if my heart habits have been hoodwinked by consumerism or nationalism or racism, knowing that, being able to think about that is not the same as acquiring new habits of love, right? And the only way to actually, you can think your way into a place where you realize, I need to be more intentional about my formation. But at that point, you have to learn to give yourself over then to Christ-oriented rhythms, routines, and practices to actually apprentice your heart habits to the kingdom of God. And this is where I think it's important. I still remember this when I was a grad student doing my PhD at Villanova. Pride is always very close to the doorstep for people who are learning theology. And I think one of the most important things that aspiring theological students and theologians can do is to commit themselves to congregations that aren't fixated on being the smartest people in the room, but in fact are spaces where you can worship with sisters and brothers who are loving God and realize you have a lot to learn from them. Because when it comes to the practice of loving God, I really don't think my degrees get me any head start. I think it's a level playing field in that regard.
Yeah. So you may never have thought of it this way, or maybe you have. It seems like a case could be made then that while these books are your books, your larger literary project is targeted at educated laity, right? I mean, the thinking Christian. An argument could be made that pastors have to read this, because if what you're saying is no right amount of thinking, right, is going to work us out of that cultural deformation, and yet the gathering on Sunday morning is so crucial, the hub as you called it. Our true worship leaders are not the ones with the guitars, it's the ones who set the liturgy.
Great worship. Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
Worship leading is happening on Thursday morning when the liturgy is decided.
Yes, and they are the curators of that for a congregation over time. So no, absolutely. My whole project depends on the renewal of churches and congregations. And I guess I sort of know, you are what you love was my endeavor to try to translate that onto a register that I think could meet people at that level. But I'm also very aware academics are the worst at writing clearly. So I know the limits of that, but then there are other people who I think are doing that kind of work of translation. But no, to me, and it's interesting, maybe another way of putting this is, I think the standard, and I don't know your curriculum, so I'm not picking on anybody, but I think the standard theological curriculum sort of made biblical and systematic the hub. And then, oh yeah, you should take a course on marriage, funerals. What I'm saying is liturgical theology should also be the heart of the curriculum. Actually, what we should do is throw out again, I'm not trying to make your life harder, but in some ways we inherited these sort of weird Germanic divisions of the theological faculties, which are an artificial rending of what is the holistic endeavor of Christian formation. And so I think a theological education that realizes liturgical theology is the hub to which Bible and systematics contribute for the sake of creating pastors who know how to, who are endeavoring to shape a congregation in the Spirit. It just kind of is it reframes the paradigm a little bit.
Yeah, well, it certainly would. You're challenging me right now. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, since I'm on the hot seat now as the dean, let's get Taylor in here. Taylor has some questions from the participants. Hello, Taylor. Welcome back.
Yes, I'm back. There have been a couple questions centered, so I'm going to try to put them together in terms of how much you've spoken about the importance of community for these liturgies and how they shape us. And so in a world, in a culture such as ours that is overly individualistic, how might you counsel us to, order our schedule, focus on the communal aspects? And could you speak to that in terms of a church community as well as maybe a family, and what's attacking us from the outside as a family when it comes to cultural liturgies?
Yes, that's a great question. So one thing I'll say is I do think the beginning of intentionality about all these matters is all of a sudden just asking ourselves that question. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think every time we all of a sudden have a new question that we didn't have before, and we realize, oh man, the defaults of American individualism are at work in all these kinds of things, and we haven't really thought about how to resist it. In some ways, once you get there, I feel like that's kind of halfway, right? Because it means you've already had the wake-up call and you've stepped up and you see what's at stake. How to actually undertake that is, I just don't want to pretend that I have sort of magical solutions in this regard. In some ways, I do think it is in the very heart of the biblical understanding of the church is already performing a different story about how to be human, right? Like, it's already a signal to us that God tells us to not forsake gathering, is a signal that we can't be Christians alone, right? So that there's some gift to be found in that community. I think we just have to realize individualism is so insidious. It can sort of sneak into even churches, right? So now the church just becomes one more consumer experience where everybody is supposed to be satisfied and getting their preferences met and things like that. And at that point, we've actually lost the battle to individualism. When I think of families and households, it's interesting. Obviously, I do think we have to just name it. And I don't want to be a person who's like demonizing technology. But I do think we have to realize that the realities of everybody having a computer in their hand that is an engine of distraction means you can actually all be in the house and still be utter individualists. So it requires a degree of intentionality to overcome that. And I think we need to name it more. I think we need to... it requires sorts of jigs that you set up in your house, for example. This is where Andy Crouch's TechWise, I think, is really helpful on matters like this. But, there's a sense in which, okay, here's the box where everybody drops their devices for the rest of the evening, and we are together and present to one another. I think at some point it gets really concrete at something like that. But I apologize. I feel like I'm not answering the very well because it's a big one and an important one.
No, I think you answered it really well. That was helpful. I actually want to press a little bit more in terms of practical helps. What did you mention before the interview? Your children are all in their 20s, but how did you, in a digital age such as this, practically work with your children and family on?
Yeah, it's funny. So my I feel like we were that parental generation who was sort of, my kids didn't have smartphones when they were teenagers. So we were sort of like also kind of clueless. I think we underestimated the significance of that. I would say, again, I don't want to treat this as a magic, but I would say the family dinner table was this sort of non-negotiable of presence, which then, one principle I talk about in You Are What You Love is micro rituals have macro implications. So it's not that you have to do big things for a long time. Sometimes you can do little things, but every day. And it has this cumulative snowball effect. I would say, by the way, public school kids around the country doing the Pledge of Allegiance every single day for 22 seconds is a deeply formative micro ritual, right? In the same way, I do think that the sort of non-negotiable of the family dinner table for us was one example, and Sunday worship, but those were sort of check-ins that were an act of resistance, you might say. But on technology, I don't pretend. I look at my friends now who have kids, who are 12, 13, 14. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I hope somebody's helping you, because I feel, right, I'm, the question is how to resist without being a Luddite about it, and realizing that there are gifts to be offered there too. But yeah, I'm a philosopher, so I don't do practical that much.
No, I think that's very helpful and indeed practical. There have been a couple questions, and a number of people viewing right now are ministry leaders, pastors. And so there have been a couple questions on how would you see the didactic side, and specifically preaching and specific preaching, doing and partnering what you're talking about with embodied liturgy and ritual?
Yes. So I think of, I'm getting sick of sitting down. I wish I could stand up, but that would be awkward. So when I think of what I keep calling this arc of a service of Christian worship, or the sweep or script of all the things we do when we are gathered around word and table, for me, the sermon is crucial and it's important. And that is the sort of, probably the didactic moment in which now, okay, the congregation has been formed by all kinds of other elements of the worship service, but now this is the moment in which God invites us to hear his word, to attend to it, to understand it, to understand its implications for our lives. And so I think of preaching, good preaching will be informative, of course. It will be instructive. I just think it will also be more than that. If you think of preaching is inescapably a rhetorical act. And if you think of a continuum of rhetoric that goes from a doctoral dissertation on one end to a poem on the other,
That's a range.
I actually think the best preaching is sort of like just onto this end of the poetic, because that's going to be preaching that doesn't just inform your intellect, but also gets under your skin and is sort of pulling you into God's story. And it's one of the reasons why I think one of the greatest things that preachers can do is apprentice themselves to poets. Because you learn the way language works in such a way that is visceral and kinetic and kinesthetic. So, secondly, on the didactic within the church, let's also not imagine that the didactic only happens in a Sunday service or in a sermon. So I'm actually very pro catechism. Precisely because I do want people to reflect. And I think the catechism, in my tradition, it's the Heidelberg. For some of you, it'll be Westminster. Heidelberg's better, but I'm just teasing. The Heidelberg, it's so warm and yeah, but so the catechism,
Poetic.
it's a very but the catechesis is another practice of reflection. It's a didactic practice.
It's a liturgy.
And it's a liturgy. And in fact, one of the things I would emphasize is that, and one of the things that's always intrigued me is that John Calvin, for his entire life, kept revising his catechism for children because he was so passionate about the formation of young people. And one of the things this might be true of Westminster too. It's definitely true of the Heidelberg Catechism. It is actually an example of what my friend John Whitley calls liturgical catechesis. That is, if you look at the way it's organized around the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. Why? Because all three of those would have been enacted in worship services, right? You always would have heard the law, you always would have confessed the creed, and you always would have said the Lord's Prayer. So when you organize the understanding of the Christian faith around what we do together in worship, then what happens is it is really crucial that people understand why they do what they do when they worship. So I think liturgical catechesis is at the very heart of the didactic moment of Christian discipleship. Because if people don't understand why we do what we do when we worship, then it becomes superstition. Then it's just tradition. This is just what we do because we do it, or because we're Dutch or Scottish or whatever it might be. Whereas, no. There's a why to this repertoire. And I think you can't start too young doing that. I think actually the best catechesis for young children is also organized around the practices of Christian worship. The liturgy of the Good Shepherd, catechesis of the Good Shepherd, praise and play in some Reformed or Presbyterian traditions. These are all great resources for already forming young people in the faith. So it's not formation or the didactic, it's the didactic for the sake of formation, and that dance of the two.
Yeah, what I hear you saying is that both the sermon and the practice of just catechism are linked into, when they're linked into the larger liturgy that performs the gospel on Sunday mornings, they're more effective rather than, okay, here's the song time and here's the sermon time. And there are these like gaps in between where people can walk around the auditorium and get to where they need to go, but there's just filling the gaps.
Yes.
As opposed to the didactic moment, whether it's sermon at home in the gathering or catechesis any other time during the week, is actually inseparable from the rest. And and there's probably a symbiotic relationship then.
Yes, in fact, because I think the worship practices on their own without the catechesis is always at risk of just becoming this superstition, this traditionalism. Yeah. So it's that gearing into one another and nourishing and supporting each other.
Right. Thanks, Taylor, for bringing those in. I want to take a little turn right here. I want to show a little video that promotes your book, On the Road with St. Augustine. That'll give you a 1 minute and 42 seconds to stand up if you want to.
Great.
That come onto the screen. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about that book, why St. Augustine, and what we particularly learned from him. So let me show this to the audience, and then we'll resume with dialogue about him and this book in particular.
Our hearts are restless, so we run, we chase, we leave. We leave because we're looking for something, for someone. We leave to look for some piece of us that's missing. We hit the road in the hope of finding what we're looking for, to find ourselves. But the road is exhausting. Not even our achievements can quell the anxiety. What was supposed to feel like arrival is unsettled by angst. Is this all there is? Where's home? What if you met a saint on the road, and that saint had a map, and had spent time at every stop-off that lured but then disappointed you? What if he could introduce you to the person you've been looking for, and lead you to a house with many rooms, where a friend would open the door and say, "Welcome home." This is not a biography. This is not a book about Augustine. It's a journey with Augustine, as a journey into oneself. It's a travelogue of the heart. It's a road trip with a prodigal who made it home, not because he figured it out, but because he was found. Join us.
Okay. So this is a travel log of the heart.
Yeah.
What does that mean? I think I got another video on here. One moment.
Good evening.
Someone's saying hello to us. There we go. So a travel log of the heart. What is that? What is this book about? And why is St. Augustine the right tour guide for us?
Yeah. So in some ways, this grows out of "You Are What You Love" a little bit. So I often go back to that opening paragraph of, I don't know if folks are familiar with Augustine's Confession. I keep it on my, it's right beside the Bible. Actually, the Bible's around here somewhere, but Augustine is right near to hand. So Augustine famously, in his Confessions, he says, he's praying to God, and he says, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." And I think it's a really profound insight into human nature, which is to say, every human heart is actually made to long for and desire God. But of course, that doesn't mean that everybody is finding him, right? They're looking for all kinds of. So the reason why I think Augustine is such an interesting character for us to retrieve in our current cultural moment is because I actually think he diagnoses the restlessness of our society. He diagnoses the angst of people looking for that ultimate satisfaction everywhere but God, right? So every human heart is primed to look for that ultimate satisfaction, but so many of us experience restlessness and unsettledness and disappointment precisely because we're looking for love in all the wrong places. We're looking for God in all the wrong things. And Augustine himself was that guy. So one of the great giants of Western Christianity actually spent his first 30 years looking for love in all the wrong places. So in a way, he's kind of read our mail. He knows what our experience is like. And then he has a sort of diagnosis of that. So I find, in general, I think it is a good practice for contemporary Christians to apprentice themselves to ancient friends, right? To just sort of get out of, because there's a sense in which by cultivating these ancient friendships, you get some distance on our own sort of the echo chamber in which we find ourselves in our current cultural moment. And you, in a way, you find Christian friends who give you a kind of objective perspective to look at ourselves. I also think, I think it was C.S. Lewis who talked about the chronological snobbery that characterizes a post-Enlightenment world where we think we're always smarter just because we're later. And I think especially people who are studying theology and for the ministry to go back to these ancient voices and to realize how much we forgot, how much, like we in many ways are just catching up to them. And I should say, I say ancient, I mean, I think the same is true to read Jonathan Edwards or John Calvin today is to be in the face of a theological profundity that is almost unthinkable in contemporary culture. So for me, I think Augustine is this really interesting character who speaks to the cultural moment in which we find ourselves. And my experience, I teach the Confessions every semester, and to me, it's like he's this psychologist of the human heart who sort of understands, and there's a vulnerability about Augustine, I guess, that I find instructive. And I also think it's very cool that so much of Western Christianity was shaped by an African. And people don't know that. Augustine was from what today would be Algeria. Huge influence on Western culture. And it's a good reminder, I think, for those of us in Northern European and North American context to realize, actually, Christianity emerges from those kinds of contexts in ways that we are still trying to catch up to.
Yeah. And Athanasius as well, basically.
Yeah.
Handedly saved the doctrine of the Trinity from semi-Pelagianism.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's helpful.
Sure.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So do you think this is a book that is apologetic in nature? Is this something that will be helpful to read with an unbelieving friend?
Yeah, this is definitely, this is, in some ways, it may be the first book where I've really intentionally written it for an audience where I don't assume that they already share the Christian faith.
Okay.
To me, it's a way of trying to show some people a rendition of Christianity that they maybe haven't considered. And for your listeners, it might be interesting to know. So what I do is I look at various kinds of sort of perennial phenomena like friendship, education, mothers, fathers, sex, privilege, power, all of these things that Augustine himself grapples with, and to which I think contemporary culture still tries to find ultimate satisfaction. Do you know what I mean? We think our smarts will save us. We think sex is where we'll finally find happiness. And Augustine tried all of these things.
Or somehow transcending our creaturely limitedness, right?
Yes.
So that's what a lot of our technologies do. They allow us to be in other places and sort of traverse space and time. And he kind of wrestled with some philosophies that did that. It's interesting that the world is so unchanged since then.
It is that there's nothing new under the sun in that sense. I mean, I think it's so interesting to read. Augustine lived the late 300s and the early 400s. So you're like, oh my gosh, that's like, millennia ago. And yet to read him today, he feels so contemporary. And you realize that the same dynamics are at play, and yet he gives us maybe insight precisely because he comes from some other culture and is sort of reading our mail. So I've been encouraged by the reception of the book so far, and folks who are using it in exactly that way, which is sort of sharing it with people that don't already believe, but are seeking. I think there's a lot more people in our culture who are sort of open and hungering and seeing the failures of all the alternatives. And I think there are sort of cracks in the secular in that regard.
A good way to describe Augustine himself. He saw the failures in all the alternatives that he could set his hand to, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. Well, Augustine is a gift to the church, and no doubt your book will be a service to the church. So thank you. I'm going to call Taylor back in here for our last few minutes, a lightning round questions. I have no idea what these are going to be, so I am innocent. Taylor, why don't you take us home with these last few questions?
Yes. Context, in my circles, I've been notorious for this speed round or lightning round, and I've been able to do it with a number of my professors in school, and it's always a fun time. So, Dr. Smith, are you ready?
I think so.
All right, here we go. What is your favorite color?
Purple.
How many languages do you speak?
3.
Which era of church history would you choose to live in other than this one?
Probably late antiquity.
Who is your favorite U.S. president?
I just became an American, so I don't.
Yes.
I have to tell you, I have a real soft spot for George W. Bush. That's a very, very complicated answer, but I'll leave it at that.
If you could choose to live anywhere in the world, where would you choose to live?
Southern France.
Okay. If you had to pick, would you rather have lunch with Muhammad or Arius?
Muhammad.
Are you a sports fan? And if so, which one do you most enjoy watching?
Formula One. Is that a sport?
Sure. Who's your, this has probably already been answered, but who is your favorite early church father?
Yeah, Augustine. Right.
Favorite dinosaur?
T-Rex.
I don't. I like
It's
it.
not very big.
You got Jamie Smith to do this on film.
That's right. What is your favorite class or topic to teach?
Philosophy of art.
Who is the smartest professor at Calvin College?
Matt Walhout, he's a physicist.
Okay. Who's your favorite author?
Oh, gosh, that's like picking a child.
Right now, how's that? Maybe right now. Favorite author right now, maybe.
Flaubert.
Do you think you could take Dr. Piotrowski in a wrestling match?
Absolutely not. Hockey fight, that might be different.
Maybe. Favorite fictional book or series?
So probably A Sentimental Education by Flaubert.
Okay. Do you have a favorite dream car? If so, what is it? What's your favorite dream car?
It would be a Porsche, but ironically, it's that 4-door that's out right now because I'm a middle-aged man. So yeah,
I like it. What is your what's your favorite biblical passage or verse?
Materialism alert.
That's right.
it's funny, a passage that I became a Christian when I was 18, and very quickly a verse was given to me, 1 Corinthians 10:31. By the grace of God, I am what I am, and I labored more abundantly than they all. And it was not I, but the grace of God who was with me. I think I sort of dwell in that passage.
Amen.
That's great. Just a couple more. Who's your favorite superhero?
I don't really. Sorry, I don't do superheroes.
That's okay. Who's your favorite preacher?
I'm going to say my own pastor, Pastor Jen Curran Holmes.
That's a really good answer. Who has been most influential in your walk with the Lord?
My wife, Deanna, without question.
Favorite musical artist? Right now.
I'll say Jason Isbell.
Okay. McDonald's or Wendy's?
McDonald's.
Coke or Pepsi?
Coke.
Yogurt or pudding?
Yogurt.
Last but not least, what is the biggest issue in evangelicalism today?
White nationalism.
Okay. I know I said last but not least, but let me throw one on just because I'm interested. Going back to your book, what are, just bullet pointed, some of the most helpful habits or practices in your daily life that turn your heart and your loves toward Jesus?
I'll just say Psalms. The Psalms are sort of the hymn book of my daily life, and water to a parched soul.
That's great. Thanks for being a good sport. That's the speed round, or your
That was fun. All right, I survived.
Yes, you did. You crushed it.
Thank you.
And Dr. Smith, let me express my gratitude again. This has been very edifying and enlightening for me. I hope for the participants out there as well.
I hope so too.
Good, thank you.
I should say to everybody, it's really weird not to see your faces. So I'm thanks for meeting us in this strange way. I hope it worked out okay.
I'm told there are like 80 people out there. I looked at some of the names. I recognize them. So they're real people. They're not just bots kind of crashing. Again, thank you for joining us out there in internet land. This is our first time doing something like this. So don't know how it came across for you, but I was thoroughly edified. Let me just say a brief word about ITS as we head out. Summer classes registration is now available, and you can register for summer classes if you're home alone or home with family members, whoever. You can participate in these classes online. The classes for the summer will all start online. Lord willing, we'll get back together and go live at some point, but they'll all start online, and registration is now open. You can see that at our website, indisem.org. There it is. I think it's on the screen now.
Yeah.
Equally, we're growing. We're looking for partners who can join with us in this important work here in the city. And so you can also give at indisem.org. Again, thank you for joining us. Thanks again to Dr. Smith. And look forward to seeing you soon, eyeball to eyeball, or again on the screen. The Lord bless you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good night, everyone.